Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another edition of IRENA Insights webinar series. My name is Karan Kocher, and I'm joining from IRENA's Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn, Germany. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I would like to introduce IRENA and a webinar series. IRENA is an intergovernmental organization with 169 member countries and another 15 countries in their accession process. We support countries in the transition to a sustainable energy future and serve as the principal platform for international cooperation, a center of excellence, and a repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. And because our analytical work and our engagement with our members generates a lot of valuable insights, we are constantly looking for more ways to share those insights with you. And that's why we launched this webinar series a few years ago. We have organized over 50 webinars on various topics, and you can check them all on our IRENA events website page. The link to that will be in the presentation slides. We understand that there are many longer deep dive webinars out there, but our aim is to keep these webinars short and sweet, lasting approximately 30 minutes. While we cannot cover everything in this time frame, we hope to give you enough information, and more than that, the sources of in-depth information to help you explore the topic further. Today, in the next 30 minutes, we will hear from Svetlana Shobanova from World Trade Organization and Luis Henero from IRENA. They will share key insights from a joint publication between IRENA and WTO titled International Trade and Green Hydrogen, Supporting the Global Transition to a Low-Carbon Economy. But before I hand over the microphone to our panelists, a few housekeeping items. The webinar will be recorded and posted on IRENA Events website. You're by default on mute, but we would encourage you to use the chat or the Q&A function to ask any questions. So without any further ado, let me welcome our panelists to our IRENA Insights webinar series. Luis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Karen, and welcome everyone to this webinar where we will be giving you a sneak peek of the recent report on green hydrogen and trade that we jointly produced with WTO. This report explores how trade policies can support the development of green hydrogen markets. It was launched at COP28 last December, and you can, of course, download this for free from either our website or WTO's website. We have split this presentation in two parts. In the first part, I will introduce IRENA's perspective on the potential role of green hydrogen in the energy transition. And then I will hand over to our colleague Svetlana Shobanova from WTO, who will give a bit more detail in terms of the trade policy implications for green hydrogen. Next slide, please. So, to provide first a bit of context for today's discussion on the role of hydrogen in the energy transition, here you can see a breakdown of the final energy consumption by energy carrier in 2020 and in 2050 globally, according to IRENA's 1.5 scenario to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. As you see today, fossil fuels dominate the picture. They account roughly for 2/3 of the final energy consumption, and electricity accounts for about 1/5 of final energy consumption. By 2050, this picture has to change significantly. Electricity becomes the main energy carrier, accounting for more than half of the total final energy consumption. And this is driven mostly by the electrification of all forms of road transport, as well as a fraction of heat demand, both in buildings and in industry. According to our WTO 2023 scenario, hydrogen and e-fuels will account for about 14% of total final energy consumption in such 1.5-degree scenario, and the bulk of that hydrogen comes from renewable power. So as you see, hydrogen's contribution is relatively modest in terms of the overall share in the energy system. It is always important to take into account that hydrogen is not an energy source. It is an energy carrier. And in general, hydrogen is a suboptimal substitute for most applications that are solved today with oil and gas. On the other hand, hydrogen will be essential for some applications, including the decarbonization of some key industrial commodities like ammonia, like steel, also in transport, for instance, in international shipping and aviation, or to provide flexibility through medium and long-term storage to manage power systems. Next slide, please. So even if we focus on those key applications for which hydrogen is needed and provides the most value, to the energy transition, we have ahead of ourselves a major challenge to scale production at the pace that we will need. First of all, it is important to understand that today, hydrogen is still a major source of emissions. It's not a decarbonization vector today. Today, we produce about 100 million tons of hydrogen globally, mostly for fertilizers and oil refining, as well as downstream chemicals. And almost all of that hydrogen is produced from fossil fuels with unabated emissions. By 2050, we need to change this picture completely to scale the production more than fivefold, while we make sure that the majority of that hydrogen is green. Just to give you a sense of scale, by 2050, just for the production of hydrogen and derivatives, we will need roughly as much electricity as the world consumes today for all purposes, so around 21,000 terawatt hours. And in terms of scaling up electrolysis, is a 3 orders of magnitude growth from roughly a gigawatt today to 5,700 gigawatts by 2050. So a very serious challenge ahead of ourselves indeed. Next slide, please. And precisely because scaling hydrogen is such a major challenge, we advise policymakers to be very selective in prioritizing those applications where hydrogen adds the most value to the energy transition. In this graph, you see an illustration of IRENA's perspective on these priorities. And as you see, there are several applications in which electrification has clear advantages. For instance, low temperature heat in buildings and industry, light cars and trucks. Then there are several applications that fall in a gray area where both hydrogen-based solutions and electrification could potentially coexist. And here it's important to mention that this is not a static picture. Technology goes very fast, particularly advancements, for instance, in batteries, which determine how much of a role is there for hydrogen, if at all, in some of these applications. And then there are several applications on the right-hand side of the picture in green. We could call them no regrets applications of green hydrogen, where electrification is unlikely to be a feasible solution for some time. And therefore, we think hydrogen-based solutions will be required. And these include the production of some key chemicals like ammonia, the processing of iron ore for the production of steel, and the production of synthetic fuels for shipping and aviation. And in this case, to the extent that biofuels would not be able to fully substitute fossil fuels for these applications. Next slide, please. So I've spoken quite a bit about challenges, now a bit of good news. The good news is that the cost of renewables is going down fast. The cost of solar PV generation has declined by almost 90% over the last decade. The cost of wind onshore has declined by 69%, and the cost of wind offshore has declined by almost 60%. So solar and wind are today the cheapest options to produce power in most markets around the world. And increasingly, we see that it's even cheaper to build new solar plants than to continue operating existing fossil assets. So the total cost of renewables are in some cases lower than the marginal running costs of fossil fuel plants. So we think that the world is now in a much better position to adopt renewable technology and to do it at a much faster pace than just a few years ago, to first decarbonize power supply, then with that renewable power supply, decarbonize end-use sectors through electrification, and yes, also to decarbonize and scale fast the production of green hydrogen for those applications where we actually need green hydrogen. Next slide, please. One key question is whether hydrogen can become competitive, and the answer is yes, if the deployment of renewable capacity and electrolysis capacity happens at the pace and the scale that we need in a 1.5 scenario, then we can see the cost reductions that you see in this graph that are driven by technological learning, economies of scale, and optimization of supply chains. Under such a scenario, we could see green hydrogen competing with fossil-based hydrogen by the end of this decade in the best locations for renewables generation. Although if we look at the developments in the market, we are still far from the pace that we need to trigger this type of learning. Next slide, please. Another key question is, where are those locations? And to answer this question, we use a GIS modeling system combining meteorological data, land eligibility criteria. So for instance, we exclude protected areas, forest areas with water stress, etc. And with some key techno-economic parameters like the cost of capital and the capex for these technologies, we determine where green hydrogen production can happen and at what cost. And you can see the results in this map. from which I think we can extract at least two key insights. The first insight is that as opposed to fossil fuels, renewables resource is very well distributed geographically. With fossil fuels, the top 5 countries control roughly 2/3 of the oil and gas reserves, respectively. And this is not the case for renewables. And this also will have implications for the overall potential trading volumes of green hydrogen, as we will see. The second insight that we can get from here is that green hydrogen production could actually become very competitive. We could see costs below $2 per kilogram in multiple locations in the most optimistic scenario, which is the one that we show this slide. Next slide, please. And when we add up all the potential that we saw in this map, we get a graph like this one. In it, you see in the horizontal axis increasing amounts of hydrogen production potential, and in the vertical axis, the cost at which we could produce that hydrogen in those locations. You see also two vertical lines in the left-hand side. The first one is the expected hydrogen demand in 2050 in our scenario, and the second one is the total primary energy supply in 2050, so the whole size of the energy system in 2050. So you see the potential to produce green hydrogen globally is about 20 times not the hydrogen demand in 2050, but the total size of the energy system in 2050. So the potential to produce green hydrogen is not the issue. However, there are some countries that have limitations in terms of area availability, for instance, Japan, Korea, some European countries, and countries that can produce sufficient amounts of hydrogen, but at higher costs. And these two factors then potentially can justify imports or exports of either hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives. Next slide, please. So to understand these key trends and to explore how hydrogen trade could play out in the future, we run a global optimization model with a 2050 perspective. And you see the resulting key trade flows in this map. You see green represents green hydrogen, and blue represents ammonia produced from green hydrogen. We estimated in this analysis that about a quarter of the global hydrogen demand could be traded across borders. But I would like to give some perspective on the overall size of this market. It is a quarter of the 14% of the energy system that I mentioned in my first slide. So it's roughly 3% of the global final energy consumption. So while it's a very significant market, it's nowhere near the volumes in energy terms of fossil fuel trade today. Of that hydrogen that would be internationally traded by 2050 in this 1.5 scenario, a bit more than half, 55% in those modeling runs, would be traded by pipeline with neighboring countries, mostly retrofitting existing gas infrastructure or existing right-of-ways for natural gas infrastructure, which would reduce costs for transporting hydrogen to neighboring countries. The other half, 40 or a bit less than half, 45%, would be shipped, but it would be shipped mostly as ammonia and to meet ammonia demand, potentially for fertilizers for sure, and potentially for shipping fuel. So it would not be reconverted back to hydrogen. We in fact do not see significant volumes of hydrogen being shipped overseas as hydrogen. So most hydrogen, about 3/4 of the global demand, would be produced and consumed closer to the demand centers. And this is a significant change from today's oil market, where about 3/4 of the global demand is internationally traded, but it's relatively similar to today's gas market, where about 1/3 of the demand is traded across borders. And I would like to conclude just with a final insight that we gained from this analysis with regards to trade and green hydrogen. It's always important to consider that the physical characteristics of hydrogen make it technically difficult and economically costly to transport over long distances. So we think that green hydrogen trade will materialize to a great extent as trading commodities produced with hydrogen rather than hydrogen itself. Some of these commodities could be ammonia, iron, methanol, or synthetic fuels. And this is because the cost of transport of these commodities is relatively small compared to the cost of transporting the hydrogen and then producing the commodities. And a key implication of this is that the prospects for cost-competitive green hydrogen production in regions with abundant and high-quality renewable energy could potentially drive the relocation of some energy-intensive industries and the emergence of new commodity trade flows for these industrial commodities. And this is something that we continue working on in IRENA, and we plan to publish some additional work on this in the coming months and years. And with this, I conclude my part and I pass it on to Svetlana Shovanova from WTO, who will dive more deeply in the policy implications for trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. So I'll take it from here, focusing first on the global trends of import and export of hydrogen and derivatives. As you can see, trading in value terms of hydrogen over the last few years has seen relatively modest fluctuations. There has been an increase in value terms since 2020, but since the trading, the fluctuations normally on the hydrogen markets are right now mainly due to fluctuations in the price of natural gas. Our estimation is that perhaps the increase in value terms since 2020 is also due to the increases in prices of natural gas. And following the conclusions that Luis made, it's not surprising to see that currently trading hydrogen is rather small as compared to trading its derivatives, ammonia and methanol. So while hydrogen trade amounted to around $300 million in 2022. Those of methanol and ammonia were respectively 14 and 18 billion US dollars in that same year. Moving on to the next slide. Focusing on the top markets, import and export markets for ammonia, methanol, and also hydrogen. Hydrogen not being on the slide, it's just interesting to mention that currently it's concentrated within a few economies. So while the United States and the Netherlands are the leading importers, the leading exporters are Canada and Belgium, which are the nominal suppliers for respectively the United States and the Netherlands, but bilateral trade in hydrogen remains largely regional, again, unsurprising based on IRENA's estimations of how the market looks like and will look like in the future. Now, the top import markets for ammonia, which is much less regionalized, more globalized market. So the top importers are actually India, followed by the United States and Morocco. And the top 5 suppliers in 2021 were countries like Trinidad and Tobago, Russia, Indonesia. Trade in methanol, the trade flows are a little bit different. China is the top market, accounting for as much as 25% of the global methanol imports. And then other major import markets are India, the Netherlands, United States, Korea, and Japan, which all of them have a smaller size between 5 and 7% of the imports. And then the main suppliers are actually the main producers also of natural gas. Again, countries like Trinidad and Tobago, Saudi Arabia, Oman, UAE, etc. So in terms of flows, that is how the markets look like currently. And then moving on to the next slide, one thing that we focused in the report is the trade in goods and services across the green hydrogen value chains. Now, why is this important? Actually, expanding the production and use of green renewable hydrogen will have trade implications at different levels. First, because green hydrogen, as we saw, will be traded in different forms as gas or as liquid in ships, and also because a lot of the trade is going to materialize in actually trading derivatives such as methanol, ammonia, methane. But also thirdly, green hydrogen can enable trade in other low carbon commodities such as green steel. And so along these different value chains, different goods and services get implicated, and trading them could be boosted. So for instance, looking at trading goods first along the value chain, trading a wide range of goods related to green hydrogen production could be affected, such as energy generation equipment, but also electrolyzers for the production of green hydrogen, compressors, pipes, etc. And this may also be the case then in the last column, as you see, end-use technologies, for instance, chemical production plants, iron-making facilities, fuel cell systems, etc. Moving on to services, some of these services are really common along the entire green hydrogen value chain. And those are things like services related to research and development, testing, analysis, consulting, training, etc. Other services are more specific for each stage, like design and engineering for the renewable energy production, then transportation and storage for the transportation storage part of the value chain, or when we go to end users for marketing. Why this mapping is important? Because boosting trade, facilitating trade in these goods and services could, by implication, facilitate the production and transportation use of green hydrogen. Next slide, please. Now, in the report, we really focus on 5 key actions that governments could take to foster trade in green hydrogen, and I'm quickly going to go through all of them briefly. But so basically, we're saying that facilitating trade by reducing tariffs and of course certain non-tariff barriers to hydrogen, but also to certain key goods and services along the value chain can support trading hydrogen trade. Then we move on to developing a sound quality infrastructure, to implementing targeted and non-discriminatory subsidies through sustainable government procurement practices, and then of course international cooperation. So I'm briefly going to talk about all 5 of these key actions. Next slide, please. First of them being fostering access to technology, lowering costs, and promoting green hydrogen production can be greatly facilitated by open trade along the supply chain, and specifically by lowering tariffs. Now, here we have an evaluation of how tariffs look like currently along the hydrogen value chain. And as we can see, the average tariff on hydrogen is not actually very high. It's about 5.3%. It's higher, however, than that for ammonia and methanol that are around 4.4, around 5%. And then you have a breakdown by the number of WTO members who are applying those tariffs. So you can see that only 7 members, for instance, are applying higher rates than 10%. Now, moving upstream in the chain, however, this is also important, not on the slide, but promoting goods and services related to renewable energy production can really help to reduce the cost for energy production, the energy production that's needed for the production of green hydrogen. And a very good example is, for instance, that open and transparent trade in solar PV energy in the past significantly enabled the cost reductions for the production of solar energy, and really made it one of the cheapest sources of energy in the world, and created a globally integrated solar photovoltaic system and market. So looking at something similar, when we're looking at the products along the green hydrogen value chain, you can see that key products necessary for the production of hydrogen, for instance, electrolyzers, while they have a relatively low tariff around 4.5%, others like compressors and specifically fuel cells have much higher tariffs, fuel cells having an average tariff of 9.8. Now, looking at other goods related to the transport of hydrogen, those can also be important. But the point here being basically that looking into lowering tariffs and making the production, the exportation of these goods more compatible can greatly boost and open up trade along the supply chain of green hydrogen. Now, moving on to the second policy action, quality infrastructure. Next slide, please, sorry. What do we need quality infrastructure for? This is really to ensure the sustainability of green hydrogen. That means really know how much greenhouse gas emissions are embedded in the production, in the transportation of this hydrogen, and also for the safety and performance of green hydrogen, things like, for instance, metrology, which allows us to evaluate the uncertainty of measurements along the production value chain. So here the starting point is really that regulators need to have a dialogue and different forms of cooperation to ensure to build the trust that they need in each other in order to enable convergence among standards or mutual recognition of standards. And the WTO provides such a forum for dialogue of members and of their regulators. And now, very briefly, just there are several tools, of course, in order to promote sustainability and to promote harmonization of these standards. One is to ensure that international standards are being created, like, for instance, right now, the ISO at COP28 just launched a technical specification on low carbon hydrogen. And the industry is quickly picking up on that. So creating international standards and adhering national regulations to international standards is very important. Same for verification procedures. And then in the process of trust building, facilitating the mutual recognition of conformity assessment procedures. This is another method to greatly facilitate open, transparent, streamlined trade in green hydrogen. And related to that, clear and predictable labeling that gives certain verifiable information for consumers is another tool on the quality infrastructure side. Next slide, please. We also talk in the report about subsidies, which can be a very powerful tool to help ensure sustained growth, not only in hydrogen production, but also to increase the electrolyzer capacity and to promote really cost efficiencies, because right now, unfortunately, fossil fuel-based hydrogen is much more cost efficient to produce than renewable hydrogen. And IRENA actually estimates that to achieve a net zero pathway by 2050, average annual investments of $136 billion will be necessary across the hydrogen value chains. So on the one hand, how can we ensure these boosts, these investments, phasing out and redirecting fossil fuel subsidies that can actually improve competitiveness of green hydrogen, and on the other hand, redirecting funding to targeted projects to boost innovation in clean tech, in green hydrogen. That is basically the other side of the coin when we talk about subsidies. Next slide, please. Government procurement and sustainable government procurement is another tool that governments have in their hands to create the largest sustainable demand for green hydrogen. So basically what governments can do is leverage sustainable procurement practices to create a large and stable demand for green hydrogen and its derivatives. This can include things like introducing minimum requirements for green products or the materials in the production process, setting up centralized auction schemes that basically pay for the cost differential for purchasing and selling of green hydrogen and its derivatives. And this can all be boosted by international cooperation, for instance, coordinated demand creating policies that can send really a strong signal to businesses to mobilize investment. At the WTO, we have our agreement on government procurement that can be that basically can play an important role to ensure open government procurement that is not tainted by the home bias, or ensures non-discrimination, transparent, open rules. And finally, the final tool that we talk about in the report is really international cooperation. So this cross-border cooperation and collaboration can help to address trade tensions that are created by different trade policies that differ in their scope, in their intensity, and avoid the rising costs and the red tape of such policies. So they can encourage technology development and innovation. They can also, there are also forums to ensure this cooperation, like IRENA's collaborative framework on green hydrogen. Part and parcel of these policies should be really also technical assistance and capacity building for developing countries. And finally, part of this support here, what we're highlighting on the slide, is one initiative by the WTO Aid for Trade initiatives that can also facilitate technology transfer partnerships to the benefit of developing countries, and really help enhance market access and create adequate regulatory conditions for the cross-border supply of hydrogen. I'm going to stop here, but we very much welcome your questions. So I'm going to give back the word to Karen.
Thank you both for this presentation. To our audience, we would encourage you to ask questions, but I think we are running out of time, and we would have to ask the questions that we have already received on the Q&A feature. So I think this one goes to Lewis. Lewis, could you elaborate between the balance of trading hydrogen versus trading commodities produced with hydrogen?
Yes, thank you, Karen. So what we mean there is that so the typical example of this would be Australia. Australia is a major exporter of iron ore, and it also has a very high quality and abundant resource of solar power production potential. There's two possible options. Option one is Australia continues exporting iron ore on the one hand, and on the other hand, it exports some form of hydrogen. And the alternative to that would be to actually add value in the production chain of steel products by reducing the iron ore directly in Australia and then exporting the metallic iron already processed. We could have similar examples of this, for instance, for the production of fertilizers or other commodities. So basically what we see is that the prospect of having good renewables resource can create an environment in which it is attractive to relocate certain industries, and then the trade flows will actually happen as commodities that are enabled by hydrogen rather than as hydrogen itself as an energy vector, if that makes sense to answer the question.
Great. Thanks, Lewis. Thanks, Svetlana. Unfortunately, our time is up for today. I think there are some pending questions in the Q&A. I would request, I would redirect those questions to our website or the WTO's website for the presentation, for the report. The presentation of this webinar will be available, including the recordings will be available on our website in a few days. I would like to thank Lewis and Svetlana for the time and for sharing their knowledge and insights on their latest work. I would also like to thank all of you for joining us today and staying with us over time. We hope you learned something new. As I mentioned, the recording and slides will be posted on the events website soon for anyone who missed any part of the webinar. Have a great rest of the day, and we hope to see you soon for the upcoming webinars.